Welcome, Congresswoman Kuster. I assume after 10 years in office, people know who you are, and kind of dive right into topics because we've got a lot to cover in an hour.
Sure.
I'm going to start with this. The president said not too long ago the COVID pandemic is over. So is it? And if not, what steps does Congress still need to take to get past it?
Sure. Well, for the most part, it is over. I think most people's lives continue on. Most people that are going back to work have gotten back to work. Not all of them, by the way, in the workplace. They're in the workforce, but we still have some, and I'll get to that. We talk about childcare and housing and other issues that are keeping people out of the workforce. But in terms of the pandemic, I just heard Anthony Fauci on this very topic, and he said for most people, it is behind us if you stay fully vaccinated, if you get your boosters. For some people who have immune compromised conditions, it will continue to be a time that they have to be very careful. It varies around the state in terms of the communities where people are still wearing masks frequently. In most of the places where I am, people are not masked all the time anymore. Kids are back in school, shops are open, and I think when you ask about what Congress needs to do, we need to be hyper vigilant about not just COVID and the next iteration of COVID, but whatever other infectious disease may be coming. And I think we all learned a great deal about our preparedness, about our supply chain, about the science of getting new vaccines and how to quickly ramp up that science and get to an effective vaccine. And then how to get those vaccines into arms. And I think that's the biggest dilemma that we have left. I often say, if President Trump had just pulled up his sleeve and taken the vaccine publicly that January, instead of hiding it until it came out in the press in June, I think COVID would have been behind us much quicker. And instead, the vaccination became very politicized. And I'll just end with this. Tragically, there are many more COVID deaths in red, conservative, Republican counties around the country than there are where there's a majority of Democrats. And that's unfortunate for our country that the response to a worldwide pandemic became so politicized.
Okay, I'm going to stick with healthcare, but another question, is the Affordable Care Act in its final form yet, or are there still improvements to be made, and what would those be?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I do serve on Energy and Commerce on the health subcommittee. So we do a lot of the COVID response, the getting to the vaccines, and obviously we're constantly monitoring the progress of the Affordable Care Act. It has been an extraordinary success in lowering the number of Americans that do not have health insurance coverage. And as a result, many, many more Americans are able to see a doctor or get preventative health care or go to the hospital if their condition requires that. We still obviously have a lot of progress and a lot of work to be done to make the progress that we need. And particularly, I'm thinking of the chronic conditions that the Affordable Care Act in the shift to preventative care was trying to address. So think about things like diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity. We can still make much more progress, I think, and people can live much healthier lives than where we are right now. So that's work to be done and more attention and focus on preventative health care. And in terms of the work to be done, what's complicated is it's at the state level in terms of participation in the Affordable Care Act. Big states, including Texas and Florida, did not expand Medicaid the way New Hampshire did and most other states did. And so I was reading recently here in New Hampshire, we're down to single digit, not very many people, single digit percentage of people who do not have any health insurance in New Hampshire. But in states, big states, there are still millions of people who did not get access to Medicaid and are living without health insurance. The other thing we can do, and it's not all in the Affordable Care Act, in the Inflation Reduction Plan, I was very pleased with the work that we finally did to lower the cost of medication. So we passed the provision that Medicare can negotiate lower costs, lower prices to consumers for medication. And that'll not just benefit seniors, but taxpayers who pay for Medicare and Medicaid, and consumers, because all of our insurance companies will then only reimburse up to the level that Medicare will be paying for medication. So we'll all have savings. We also capped out-of-pocket expenses at $2,000 a year for seniors on Medicare Part D. That's critical to avoid those medical bankruptcies that I referenced. We capped insulin for diabetics at $35 per month. And then the one that I'm most proud of, because it was my bill, is that we vaccines for seniors will be free. So that's not just the COVID vaccine and the flu vaccine, but it includes the shingles vaccine, which can cost hundreds of dollars.
Bill, did you want to ask anything about transparency in cost?
Not at this point.
Okay, then I'm going to turn to abortion. In the wake of the Supreme Court's Dobbs ruling, is there now brewing abortion-related legislation that you'd support?
Yes, I voted for now twice the bill that we call the Women's Health Protection Act. And what that does is to put the Roe v. Wade ruling by the Supreme Court back in 1973 into federal law. So it becomes the law of the land for the whole nation, every state. And it's in keeping with my constituency, which is 3 out of 4 New Hampshire voters supported Roe v. Wade, support that standard of legal abortion up to viability. And it's a very big issue in this election. My opponent supports criminalizing abortion nationwide. He says this is a federal issue. We can agree on that, but he wants to criminalize. He said life begins at conception. He's 100% pro-life. And the bill that is likely to be voted on if the Republicans take over the House of Representatives is a bill called Life at Conception Act. And what that is, 80% of the Republican caucus is already signed on to that bill as co-sponsors. It is literally what it means, criminalizing abortion at conception, at 0 weeks, and no exceptions, no exception for rape or incest or the health or well-being of the mother. And I just think that's so contrary to the New Hampshire ethos of live free or die, less government interference in people's personal private lives. And he has said repeatedly, he ran during the primary the entire time. He's the only pro-life candidate. He's 100% pro-life. Life begins at conception. And I've been very clear for the beginning, when I first started running, I've always been a pro-choice advocate, advocating for less government interference in people's personal private lives. And, you know, my lived experience, I have kind of a unique perspective. I was an adoption attorney for 25 years. And so I've represented over 300 birth mothers. And I did that because I believe in the pro-choice position, the full range of choices. But as a result, I know much more than the average person about how every pregnancy is different. I had clients coming to me who didn't even know they were pregnant for many months or didn't tell anyone that they were pregnant for many months. And, age 14 to 44, and from junior high school to a junior at Cornell, this is a common experience, unexpected, unplanned pregnancy. And I just believe in trusting women and trusting physicians, and that it's not the government's role. And I just add one last thing about how extreme my opponent's position is. He has doubled down numerous times on this criminalization of abortion without any exceptions. And the obvious question from the reporters has been, well, wait a minute, what about when the life of the mother is in danger? And he's come up with a novel theory that I find frightening, which he's mentioned several times recently, that there should be panels of people. He doesn't describe who they would be. I call them dudes in suits. I don't know who these people would be, but they would decide, not the woman, not the physician, not her husband. There may be children at home, there may be lots going into this decision, and he wants the government to make this decision about whether she lives or dies.
The worst of the opioid crisis seemed to be behind us when COVID hit, but now states are struggling with increasing deaths and other effects. What needs to happen on a national level to get back to where we were, or perhaps do even better?
Thank you so much for bringing that up. And it is one of the great disappointments as we emerge from COVID, is the state of our mental health and addiction that in large part was impacted by the COVID shutdown. And so I am the founder and co-chair of what we call the bipartisan Addiction and Mental Health Task Force. And we are pivoting to this issue. We have been for the last 6 months as we're coming out of COVID. And we've passed a package of bills in the House that we expect will be passed in the Senate in November that will reinforce the paradigm of access to treatment, long-term recovery. We know we have to be better about recovery housing, medically assisted treatment, which is a very big part of this. I've been living this experience in my own life. My older brother out on the West Coast got caught up in the opioid epidemic through a series of surgeries 5 years ago. He was in recovery and doing well, but COVID really set him back. And it was because in part, the treatment moved online, as did, all of our lives. And AA and NA and those types of meetings were online. He's 72 years old. He lives in a very rural community way up in the mountains. He was not equipped to keep up with that in an online setting. Some people found that it was more accessible. And so I am working for making sure that we continue to reimburse for telehealth, both for addiction and mental health treatment. And I think that's important for some people. It helped to get over the barriers of getting a babysitter or driving over the mountain in the snow or even having a vehicle. But we need to learn from the lived experience during COVID, find out where people fell through the cracks, get them the help that they need. And we need to fully fund the treatment programs that are in this package of bills that need to be passed in November.
Representative, if we could turn to inflation for a moment,
Sure.
what steps would you support to help control inflation as well as the debt and the deficit?
Yeah, thank you for that. So I laid out part of what was in the Inflation Reduction Act that we passed in August that I voted for, with the healthcare, bringing down the cost of medication, which is so important, particularly for seniors on fixed income. Inflation is the hardest on seniors because they're on fixed income. I should point out as an aside, my opponent and the Republicans in Washington want to cut Social Security and Medicare. And I think that's a very dangerous direction to go. That's not the right approach. Also in that bill, we cut the deficit by close to $2.5 $238 billion, so several $100 billion. And when it comes to the deficit, you have to take yourself back to the Trump years and the $2 trillion deficit that was incurred when they lowered taxes on millionaires and billionaires and didn't help the rest of us. So we need to continue to tackle the deficit. I support a balanced budget, and I would support that at the federal level. And then we need to tackle the food and energy costs. A big part of that actually has to do with price gouging and profiteering. And the example I'll give you is when the price of gas was going up, 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 up. Luckily now it's come back down. I saw $3.29 in Nashua this week, but it got almost to $5, but it didn't go to $5 in New Hampshire because I think the oil companies knew we would have started carpooling or not taking the extra trip. And instead it came back down. Now, for a number of reasons, one of which is that the president released oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, but he also called out the price gouging and profiteering. And it's important to note ExxonMobil made 300% profit during the what the consumers thought was, you know, a shortage of oil, and they had to charge us more at the pump. The same can be said in the food industry. I'm on the agriculture committee, and I'll be working on the farm bill next year. And at the same time that you walk into the store and General Mills cereals, most of those name brands are over $4, close to $5 a box. By the way, the generics are not. The brand of the store, without all the marketing and everything else, is still down in the $2 to $3 range. But at the same time that they're raising prices on literally everything, General Mills had a 200% increase in stock buybacks. So I think we need to tackle this price gouging and profiteering that's going on at the expense of American consumers.
How would you tackle price gouging and profiteering?
Well, we've got legislation, and I mean, first of all, you have to go after the antitrust implications of it. Is that there's so much consolidation. The meat industry is the best example. And during COVID, when you couldn't find meat on the shelves, it turns out when I talked to the local co-ops here in New Hampshire, if they had a source of local meat, they had meat on the shelves. And so we need more competition. There's only 4 large meat processing companies now in the country. And I want to invest in local agriculture. This has been priority for me through the past 3 farm bills, and is to invest in the distribution system, support our local farmers so that we can eat food closer to home and not pay the price of shipping it all the way across the country. I'll give you a good example. Lettuce, greens, now grown in Loudon, New Hampshire, fresh greens all winter long from greenhouses. The price in my store is better than the price that I would pay for lettuce that's been shipped halfway across the country. The jobs are here, the money stays here in the economy locally. So we have so many subsidies in the farm bill for mega agriculture, big corporate farming in the Midwest and California and Florida. I want to shift those dollars with my New England colleagues, with my colleagues who support smaller local farms, to support us growing food and buying food closer to home and bringing down price for the American consumer.
If I could just interject
I'm sorry.
if I could just interject a quick follow-up. Did I understand you to say that you are in favor of a balanced budget? And if that's the case, how would you achieve it?
I am. I think it's a good discipline that we have here in New Hampshire. We talk frequently in the New Hampshire delegation about it because, of course, Senator Shaheen and Senator Hassan were both governors that lived with a balanced budget. As my understanding from my colleagues on the Appropriations Committee, the most difficult part would be the defense and Pentagon spending. And what they've been challenged by is the lack of accounting and accurate, accurate modeling for what the defense budget would be. And typically what happens, something like Ukraine comes along, and I support the funding for keeping democracy alive in Ukraine and across Europe. And so since I've been in Congress, the challenge has been those types of, they'll start with a balanced budget. I mean, we always do start with balancing the budget. But what ends up happening is that there are exceptions to balancing the budget for these exigent circumstances. So I think it's disciplined by our conferees when they meet between the House and the Senate, and they're hammering out the final budget for the year.
You mentioned energy policy a moment ago. What specific changes would you envision in energy policy, being cognizant of the realities and the opposition?
Sure, and you have a unique perspective in the State House, but let me explain it this way. So I voted, I'm very, very proud. I'm also on the Health Subcommittee and the Energy Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, and I'm very proud of the work that my subcommittee did on the largest climate bill ever to pass. That's also was in the Inflation Reduction Act. Those provisions came out of our committee, and it's investing in clean, renewable energy, reducing carbon pollution and saving the planet, at the same time creating jobs and building the economy. In New Hampshire, regretfully, and these are decisions that have been made by our Republican governor and by our Republican legislature, we are woefully behind our New England neighbors in embracing clean, renewable energy and bringing down the cost of energy. So the examples that I would give, Vermont, 17% solar, Massachusetts, 20% solar, New Hampshire, 1% solar. And as a result, consumers in Rhode Island, for example, are going to spend $750 less this year for their energy costs than consumers here in New Hampshire. In Vermont, it's going to be over $500 less. And it's costing us, not only is it worse for the planet and for the future of our children and grandchildren, it's worse for our pocketbooks today. And so I would rapidly ramp up not just solar, but wind, offshore wind. This all may be moot in another 10 years when offshore wind makes New England essentially independent of any outside energy. I worked on the hydro provisions in the bill. There are 90,000 hydro dams across the country, 9,000 here in New Hampshire, and we can retrofit those dams with turbines for, again, clean, renewable energy, not be chasing fossil fuels for another 20 or 50 years.
It seems like there's general agreement there's a major problem on our southern border. How do we fix it?
I do agree that there's a major problem on the southern border. I went down there during the Trump administration when they were separating children from their families. That was tragic. That's not happening, but we don't have sufficient resources in terms of lawyers and people to process the migrants that are arriving at our border in an orderly way. And we don't send people quickly enough to their family members who typically they're coming to join family members that are already here. But at the crux of the matter, our legal immigration system has broken down. It is now taking, I was in Nashua this week talking to Indian Americans who have been here 20 and 30 years that don't even have a green card or the right processing. They should be citizens by now. They're offering their expertise, their talents to our economy. A huge part of the growth in Nashua and in our tech industry here in New Hampshire has come from the Indian American community. We need to do better by way of our southern neighbors for dealing with, terrorism and all of the reasons that they're flooding north. I do agree with that. We need better technology to stop the flow of fentanyl into the country. But, even here in New Hampshire, one of the issues that I'm working on we have only 2 or 2.2% unemployment at this point. So we have thousands of jobs. Fidelity has 1,000 new jobs, BAE 800 new jobs, Dartmouth Health 1,200 openings. We need people desperately. And we went 4 years with virtually no immigration during the Trump years. And now what I'm trying to do, the hospitals in Northern New Hampshire are really struggling to recruit and retain physicians. So I came up with a provision for the Northern Borders Regional Commission to process J-1 visas for physicians from overseas so that they can come work in these hospitals. Next year, I'd like to broaden that to healthcare workers generally so that we will have the workforce that we need, excuse me, to take care of our population. I apologize. This is one of the downsides of campaigning is losing your voice. So I'm drinking tea and sucking on, excuse me, sucking on cough drops. I apologize.
No problem. Yeah, the problem at the border certainly has gotten worse and maybe is at an all-time bad situation right now, which your opponent and others in the Republican Party lay at the feet of the Democrats. What do you say about that?
Interesting is they don't have any solutions. If you listen carefully, and I have, you know, I would have voted for the John McCain bill that Kelly Ayotte voted for. There used to be very strong bipartisan cooperation on immigration. This is going back a long time. Jean Shaheen voted for that bill. Speaker Boehner didn't let us vote for that bill. It's comprehensive immigration reform. That's what we need. But there are 0 votes in the Republican caucus for comprehensive immigration reform. And instead, I don't think they want the issue to go away. I think they like to demagogue it as a political issue and put politics over people's lives. And I think it's tragic. By the way, I will say I did push back on the White House about the Canadian border. That was very frustrating for us that they took so long to reopen the Canadian border. And as a delegation, we had to push very, very hard because it was interfering with people's lives and with the business community, with the tourism in the North Country. So I think, you know, I will agree with you that the administration can do better, but I certainly wouldn't concede to the Republicans since I was there in the Trump administration when they were literally tearing infants from mothers' arms. That's cruel.
So, Congresswoman, there's a homelessness and housing insecurity problem here in New Hampshire, but all over the country. What would you say is the role of Congress in trying to address that?
Absolutely. And again, this is a stark difference with my opponent. He's opposed to all of the federal funding and the programs. He has said that he would let the market decide. Well, where the market has left us right now is 0.5% vacancy. A healthy place for an economy to be would be 5% vacancy. So there is just literally no place to turn. And going back to the inflation question, in New Hampshire, housing, lack of childcare, lack of immigration, and lack of supported employment for people dealing with mental health and addiction problems are what is driving this 2% unemployment. We just simply don't have enough people who are in a position where they have a roof over their head and they're available to go to work and they're capable to get there 5 days a week on time and do their job. So what I've gotten behind, and I'm very, very involved in this, is federal incentives for housing. Sometimes they're in the form of tax credits for low-income housing. Sometimes they're incentives around workforce housing. And I'm pleased to say we need 20,000 new units to catch up. But I'm pleased to say that I've spent the last 6 months driving around my district, touring housing projects that are going up all across the district. So Salem has a major new housing project. That one includes particularly an element of affordable housing, workforce housing. Hudson, Nashua has 400 units coming on in the next year. Keene Housing does a terrific job. Claremont has a lot of new housing right along the river. There's a big project going on there. And then a supported low-income housing for women coming out of addiction, dealing with families. That program was incredible. Hanover visiting housing for people with disabilities. Lebanon has new housing. Bethlehem has new housing. Littleton has new housing. So everywhere I go, I'm trying to help them get access to the federal funding. In Plymouth, we did an incredible project for veterans that were homeless and got brand new housing built for 40 homeless veterans. So they now live in apartments and can care for themselves and get the support that they need, mental health and physical health. So I'm a big fan of doing more on housing through the federal government. And I think it works for our economy. I think it's a part of our infrastructure. I voted for it in both the American Rescue Plan, in the infrastructure bill, and would continue to vote for it in the future.
So wages would factor into the affordable housing equation, I should think.
Very
And
much.
New Hampshire state lawmakers seem to have no appetite for raising the minimum wage above the federal level of $7.25 an hour. Yet all other New England states have implemented higher minimums. At what point should Congress step up and raise the national wage?
Now. So I do support the $15 minimum wage, and I have supported that in the past, although now it's even more relevant. I was using a restroom in a McDonald's the other day and saw $18 for an entry level in a McDonald's, which is more than a lot of entry level nurses are making in hospitals around the state. So look, New Hampshire's been woefully behind on wages for years, and that's probably part of the reason why we fell so far behind in our housing stock, is that honestly, there's not a county in the country where you can live on $7.50 an hour. And that's true in every county in the state of New Hampshire. By the way, I believe strongly in workforce development and improving the skills so that the employers of entry-level people have the benefit of their skills. And one of the best events I've been to recently was a graduation program at Nashua Community College for a microelectronics course, working with semiconductors and small electronics. And it was fantastic. These people had done a 10-week course. They're coming out of there with job offers from BAE and a dozen other companies in that region. And they will be making serious wages for the first time ever. Some of these people had been homeless. Some of them had been living in shelters. And even better, once they get these jobs, the companies will pay the tuition for them to continue their studies and improve their their abilities on behalf of the bottom line of the company. So I think that's the best solution. And I have legislation for companies that have those types of partnerships with community colleges to get a tax benefit, just the way they would for research and development, but investing in the future of their employees.
So we're an aging nation, and as you know, particularly in New Hampshire, so what needs to be done to ensure seniors can live out the retirement years in security and dignity? You mentioned Medicare and Social Security earlier. What other steps could Congress take?
Well, again, I think this is one of the, along with abortion, I think this is one of the most extreme differences. Although I should probably say that every program that I've mentioned, the American Rescue Plan, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS and Science Bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, my opponent would have been a no vote. And I can't even imagine where our economy would be if we had not saved the economy in March of 2020 when we were hit by a global pandemic and facing the economic collapse. And as I'm going around the state, my district, we're in the midst of our 30 diners in 30 days. So I'm visiting small businesses in every community, and every single one of them took the Paycheck Protection Program. They took the loans, they had the loans relieved, as did my opponent. And they say we wouldn't be open without it. So number one for seniors is to make sure that the economy is strong so that they can live with dignity, that they have safe housing that's available and affordable, that they have access to affordable food. And I was shocked to see that Republicans in Washington have put at the top of their priorities, if they take over the leadership in the House, cutting Social Security and Medicare benefits. That is the opposite of what I believe in. And I think if my opponent goes to Washington, that's exactly what he would be voting to do. I support, we had a Social Security 2100 Act, which spells out how to shore up Social Security and make sure that it's available for generations to come. And I don't think it's too much to ask to have millionaires and billionaires and corporations pay their fair share of taxes. The reality is, to have a corporation the size of Amazon pay zero taxes is not a plausible way to take care of the people in our society who have worked hard their entire lives. They've paid into Medicare and Social Security. Those are their benefits that they've earned. And I think we can shore it up. I voted to shore it up. And on the Medicare front, I spelled out what we've done to lower the cost of medication. And the biggest thing was to make sure that Medicare can negotiate lower drug prices. And that was something that came out of the Bush years, that was a boondoggle for Big Pharma. My opponent's worked his whole career for Big Pharma. We took on Big Pharma and we won. And, already the Republicans are talking about how they would reverse that. And I think that would be tragic.
So how do we shore up the Social Security Trust Fund? What's in that bill? What measures?
That it has to do with taxes with corporations paying their fair share of taxes. Right now, our tax system benefits the wealthiest among us and the wealthiest corporations among us. And so, as I said, you have companies like Amazon paying zero in taxes when hardworking granted staters pay their taxes. And so that's the way I would approach it.
But isn't that separate from, that tax money is separate from the Social Security Trust Fund, right?
No, it's in this bill. It's in the Social Security 2100 Act that we voted for. It's funding, it's funding from corporate taxes to shore up Social Security.
Oh, okay, I see.
If I could just follow up on something you said a moment ago. You talked a little bit about the payroll protection program. And I'm wondering, with all the money that went out the door, was there a lack of accountability and oversight in some instances? Should that have been set up in a way that was less wasteful?
You ask a very interesting question, but I think you have to take yourself back to March of 2020 when all of these businesses would have closed their doors. We would have had rampant hunger. We would have had people living in the streets. We would have take your own company or any company in Keene. So there was an urgency to that program. Frankly, I think it was nothing short of a miracle that we stood that program up before the end of March. We flew to Washington from all over the country on empty airplanes during the shutdown in order to get that program stood up. And yes, were there problems? Absolutely. And there's accountability right now. And you can read every single day in the press about companies and fraud that's being called out, and people are paying substantial fines so look, that was a unique circumstances. It's unlike anything I've ever lived through before. We were on Zoom calls and in meetings round the clock to try to set that program up in a very, very short period of time to make sure. And frankly, I think it was brilliant, that approach, the Paycheck Protection Program, is rather than tackling it with, shoring up housing with this fund and shoring up food with this fund and shoring up transportation with this fund and, all of the different things that a family spends a paycheck on. The concept was just keep the paycheck coming. And honestly, it's a fascinating time looking back. Our unemployment went up to 16% in New Hampshire. But that means that 84% of the people never missed a paycheck. They kept working. I remember calling Fidelity that Monday morning after the fateful Friday the 13th, thinking that they would be in a panic about their 6,000 employees in Merrimack, New Hampshire. And he said to me, no, we're fine. I said, what do you mean? And he said, 98% of our employees nationwide are working from home already. And that was like barely 72 hours after the shutdown. And so people work from home. People on the front lines put their life in jeopardy. I was meeting with firefighters this week who, without any vaccine, without even proper PPE and protection, were answering the call of duty. We got through it together. It was a challenging time. It was a difficult time. And as we mentioned with mental health and addiction, there are people who suffered because of it. But I will not make any excuses for that program. It was extraordinary that our economy is as strong as it is. And frankly, I think it's completely irresponsible for my opponent to say that he would have voted against all of this, because we wouldn't even have an economy in New Hampshire if he did.
Turning to election integrity, what should Congress do to protect voting rights and ensure election security beyond the Electoral Reform Act now being considered?
Yeah, and I support that, by the way, and hope that we do get that done in November. I think that's critically important. I think what Congress needs to do is to shore up our elections, which are safe. Again, back to COVID, to me, it's nothing short of extraordinary how well we Americans all across this country, most of them volunteers, by the way, were able to pull off a successful election in the midst of this highly contagious pandemic. The early voting was successful. The mail-in voting was successful. The president tried 60 different lawsuits and not any fraud was found. And so to me, what's irresponsible right now are candidates that are calling into question the results of the 2020 election, and some of them going so far as to call into question the results yet to come of the 2022 or 2024 election. That is the biggest threat to our democracy. And that's why I say democracy is literally on the ballot. Our freedom is on the ballot. Our democracy is on the ballot. I think what Congress can do is make sure that secretaries of state and state election officials have the resources that they need, upgrading equipment where they need it, using the best methods. In New Hampshire, we were lucky because most places in New Hampshire hadn't gone to a completely digital voting system. Most of us have paper ballots that we feed into the machine. And so we have the paper backup, and now that's considered sort of best in class to do it that way. But let's make sure that these volunteer election officials all across the country have the resources that they need, the training that they need. And but I will be honest with you, I think it's over 200 Republicans running, many of them for secretaries of state, for county offices that will impact the outcomes of elections. And they, to this day, will not concede that Joe Biden was the lawfully elected president of the United States. And that is a tremendous risk to our democracy and to our future.
You mentioned childcare earlier. How do we lower childcare costs and still pay childcare workers the wage they deserve?
That's the toughest question, but I actually have an answer now, and I'm so pleased. So I supported the funding that would have been in the Inflation Reduction Act for childcare, but got held up by Joe Manchin. So I'll start with that. To me, childcare is a part of infrastructure, and just the way we pay for roads and bridges and highways to get our workers to their jobs and get our goods to market, we should be supporting childcare. One of the most important statistics that I've learned in my preparation for all this is that New Hampshire lost 12% of women from our workforce during COVID, and only half have come back. So when you look at that 2% unemployment, a big part of that is the fact that we haven't sufficiently supported families to be able to juggle raising children and working 2 jobs. And so these are families where the woman has decided not to re-enter the workforce, and we are losing half the talent, half the brains, half the ability to run our businesses and run our economy. So the example that I'll give that really is very heartening, I visited a childcare called Little Antlers in West Plymouth a few weeks back. And what this is a project put together by Mid-State Health Consortium, which is the community health center for the Lakes region. They were so short-staffed or dealing with retention and recruitment of primarily women in their workforce that they realized they needed to take on the community need of childcare. They built a beautiful facility. And to address what you pointed out, the conundrum of how to have affordable childcare with good enough wages to have quality childcare and to recruit and retain childcare workers, the workers at the childcare center are going to be employees of Mid-State Health. And so they'll have good wages, they'll have benefits, which childcare workers frequently don't, vacations and holidays and healthcare. And I think it's going to be a huge success. We were helpful in getting federal funding from 2 different sources for that project. One is U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development Funding, which is a great source. We've used this all across my district, including in the Keene area. And that is very, very low interest rate loans. I think they had a $2 million loan at 2.5% interest. And then the other is called the Northern Borders Regional Commission, which also now covers Cheshire County. And we've had projects in Keene, including recently, we were involved in a big project about your emergency response for Cheshire County. And we were over there doing a photo op with a new emergency vehicle. But these are the kinds of funding that not only do I support, but that we work in helping community organizations, whether they're for-profit, not-for-profit, municipal, all over my district. And as I left there that day, I said, I would love to put one of these facilities in every town in my district. And I think we would solve our workforce issues. And our kids would get a great start. You know, I'm a big fan, having raised my own sons where my husband and I were working, and high quality childcare is a great benefit to families. So I just heard, when I was making remarks at the Nashua Chamber yesterday, a fellow came up to me afterwards from the YMCA, and they're going to do childcare with one of the Nashua hospitals. And I think that's a model that could work, where people would have high quality childcare workers. They'd be paid well, but we can make the childcare affordable for everyone.
I'm going to shift gears a little bit here. We haven't talked about anything in terms of foreign policy. And I'm wondering, given the situation in Ukraine, it makes you wonder, what's the furthest you'd be willing to go to deter Russia from harming our NATO allies in that region?
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent question, because this is what's been on our minds since Putin invaded Ukraine. So we've had a series of classified briefings and preparing us on what Putin's intentions, what the state of the war, what our intentions are. So you make the important point, and I hope everyone understands this, that Ukraine is not currently a NATO ally, but if the fighting were to go beyond the borders of Ukraine, we would defend our NATO allies. What's been tricky is trying to figure out how to support the freedom fighters in Ukraine who support democracy, and we want to defeat Putin's attempt to crush their democracy. So far, when you ask the question of how far would I go, so far, I've been supportive of Stinger missiles, Javelin missiles. What I think we could do more of now is, excuse me, oh my gosh, the drones, I'm sorry. There's a lot of words in all of this, as you can imagine, after an hour straight. So anyway, we could do better giving them drones, where they're learning how to shoot down the Russian drones right now, but I think they could gain an advantage if they had better drone technology. So that's what I would do for Ukraine, which my hope is that we don't have to come in on behalf of our NATO allies, that we can resolve this to the point where eventually Mr. Putin does have to come to the bargaining table, does have to negotiate a ceasefire, and we can turn our attention to rebuilding Ukraine. I have been opposed to American boots on the ground other than where we currently are stationed being support. So, you know, we have provided some intelligence, for example, that type of thing. But as of yet, we don't have American troops in Ukraine or in harm's way in the neighboring NATO countries.
And so elsewhere, a similar question regarding Taiwan, and
Yes.
China's eyeing that as their property.
Yeah.
How far should or would we go in terms of protecting Taiwan's independence?
Yeah, again, you know, it's hypothetical crossing that line, and We're not there yet. And again, I hope we will not get to that point. But certainly Taiwan is an ally and a valued ally. And one of the issues that may have been missed by most people, because it's tricky when the information is classified, we can't be talking about it. But I can certainly say, without revealing state secrets, I can say what was already in the news. One of the reasons that Speaker Pelosi took the trip to Taiwan is because we were passing this CHIPS legislation about semiconductors, but a very, very high percentage of semiconductors that we rely on in our military, not just in our phones and watches and dishwashers and cars, but in our military, are made in Taiwan and China. And she was wanting to make that relationship very clear to the Chinese, that we are very loyal to Taiwan, and that they ought not to take any steps. And there's a whole strategy in terms of the Pacific Theater and our military. This happened under the Obama administration, turning our military toward the Pacific, and containing both Russia and China is at the heart of our defense strategy and our diplomatic strategy. And I agree with that. I agree with the White House on that. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say I find it frightening for the future of our country when President Trump and these far-right MAGA Republicans, President Trump has just endorsed my opponent. And I fear for our country if they take over Congress and would appease Putin and would allow Putin to just march right through and take over Ukraine. I think my opponent has taken that position, that he would not support defending Ukraine.
Before we go, I'd like to ask about gun control.
Mm-hmm.
Congress passed its first significant gun control bill this past summer. In your view, what's the next step?
Well, that was an important step. And by the way, keep in mind that everything we've talked about that has passed with a 4-vote margin in the House and a deadlock tie 50-50 in the Senate. So it's quite extraordinary that we've been able to do as much as we have. But in terms of reducing gun violence, I think that was a really critical step. I voted for the bill. And in particular, I was focused on that portion of the bill. I'm the founder and co-chair of the bipartisan task force to end sexual violence. And I do a lot of work in domestic violence, sexual violence, and there's a whole pattern. You can see it, I'm sure, in your newspaper, but all across this country, of homicides of women where there's a long history of abuse and assault. So that bill for convicted assault, domestic violence, convicted batterers, if you will, that they could not legally have a gun. I think that's really important to try to stop those murders. By the way, my opponent, once again, is opposed to that. He would allow convicted felons to convicted batterers to have weapons. In terms of next steps, this is an issue that we debate at length, is how to get ahead of these tragic mass shootings in our schools, in our grocery stores, in our churches, in our communities. One of the issues that I was pleased to see in our bill was to combine mental health treatment and reduction of gun violence. I don't think those are two separate things. I don't think we should have a big debate. Is it either or? I believe it's both and, but I believe we know enough now that we should have methods in place for screening. They're talking about pediatricians doing screening about violence. and for schools to do screening to try to understand the profile of these people that are so disaffected. And I'm hoping that the word is getting out to more parents not to be giving these weapons of war, these weapons of, automatic weapons to young people. There was just a conviction this week of a young man in a previous shooting who had gotten the gun as a gift just a few days earlier from his father. And I think there will be lawsuits about liability. So research and liability are next for us in terms of where we go from here in Congress. The NRA has been so strong historically that they've been able to avoid liability. And I think that's wrong. I think that if we had, wrongful death lawsuits, that there would be many, many more protections in place.
So could I just follow up and ask, so are you for an assault style weapons ban?
I have supported that, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I believe they're weapons of war, that there's not, I've yet to meet a hunter in New Hampshire. And I understand the Second Amendment and how strongly people feel in New Hampshire about hunting and raising their food and, the enjoyment that they get, taking their family and the tradition that they have. I have tremendous respect for that. But I've yet to meet a hunter that's going out to get a buck with an automatic weapon of war that can shoot dozens of rounds in a matter of seconds. And most military that I've ever spoken to agree. They don't think these weapons are should be in the hands of civilians without training. Maybe there's an option that they could be held at gun ranges, because I think there are some people that enjoy it, but to have them just available for youth to walk in, troubled youth to walk into a school and kill 30 children. We can't be a society of laws and live with that.